Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer-editor Chris Arrant from Newsarama. Chris, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoy being on this program.
Chris, could you tell us a little bit about Newsarama? Because, there are a lot of websites out there that have information about comics, but my understanding is Newsarama is one of the oldest and most established websites out there.
We're one of the longest running websites about comics. It's been around. We launched in 1998 on a little forum called Prodigy. Some people might remember that. Then we graduated up to a full website in 2000, and we've been consistently covering news, breaking big stories, doing in-depth interviews like this one here, and covering comic conventions in person all over the United States and into Canada. And we've been doing that consistently for over 20 years now.
When it comes to getting news about comics, this show focuses on sort of behind-the-scenes stuff. But my understanding is that Newsarama is looking at breaking news, whether it's a new storyline that's coming out or an issue that might change the status quo. So how do you get your leads, and how do you make sure that you can get the story out without it sounding too much like a PR piece for DC, Marvel, or one of the other publishers?
Like, we're best known for breaking news. We get that just through basic reporting, just talking to the sources, talking to the people that know. That whether that be the companies involved or whether that be the creators involved. There's also retailer stories. There's just sometimes a man on the street, just the opinions of fans. It can be news. It's just to get context for why something is important instead of us just saying that it's important. So we kind of talk to all different corners of the industry to kind of understand comics and then paint that picture for the people that read our site.
Going back to, let's say, the 90s, comics had a different, I guess, place in American life. And now comics are basically the place where movies and TV shows are getting their inspiration from. And when we take a look at coverage of news events, as I recall, you were recently featured or quoted in the New York Times when they were talking about some events that are happening in Superman comics. So again, it's kind of interesting to see how not only has the culture changed where we're accepting comics as entertainment, but even now an establishment like the New York Times is going to a noted news source in comics to make their stories more, I guess, correct.
For that example, what it was is DC had announced that Superman was going to reveal his secret identity to the public. I happen to know the writer for the New York Times, George Gustinas. We published an article just explaining how, yes, this is happening, but then we gave context to it and explained how it had happened before. And then we explained what the reactions were then at the time, and then how DC retcon, which is a comic book term, in terms of retroactively changing something, so his secret identity was later restored. So we kind of give context because we know that the people that read our site might remember that, but some people may not or may have a different view of it. So we try to present it as news for people that are seeing this for the first time, but also people that have seen this before and kind of understand how this fits in historically, the long history of comics.
So you are a writer and an editor. So I'm wondering, when you are dealing with a writer who's covering a story that's coming up, something that might be an upcoming issue or story arc, how are you working with that writer to make sure that they have what they need to cover the story, but also make sure that it fits in with the style that Newsarama is looking for?
We have an informal style guide for just matters of grammar, punctuation, formatting, and stuff like that. But in general, I help it, like a writer, find what's the most interesting thing in what they're focusing on, and just to help them drill down to that and focus on the questions, basically trying to answer the questions that the readers would have. Or if you can't answer the questions, then basically explain what's going on with that, to really get an in-depth understanding, like something that you just can't communicate in a few sentences, but to really grapple with what's happening and why it's happening. And as an editor, I'm kind of a sounding board to help them think through the ideas and bounce back and forth between them to kind of come up with a better story by the end of the day.
Now, you say by the end of the day. What is your deadline? Is this something where you're updating the site constantly, or is it something where we have new content that comes out every Friday afternoon, let's say?
As a website, we're pretty much running all the time. Our main kind of time frames that like we publish at least every 30 minutes, Monday through Friday from around 9 to 7 Eastern time. Certain instances call for that to go beyond that, like when we're covering a convention. Like I'm in the midst of planning for one for Chicago, and we'll be working all weekend. And sometimes for movie premieres or midnight comic book releases, we'll keep different hours. But when we're here, we're constantly publishing. Like right now, as we do this, my other editor will have probably published about 4 stories just during the span of our conversation here.
Now, you mentioned going to conventions. So I know going to conventions as a fan is one thing, but going to a convention as a journalist is a completely different animal. So what's your day like when you go to one of the big conventions?
Just for example, the one I'm preparing for now, it is in Chicago. Before even the doors open, there's a lot of comic creators and comic staff that are in the city, in that hotel, and around. So I'll be interviewing the heads of DC Comics before the convention opens its doors, and I'll be following that interview. Then once the convention opens, I'll go to the floor, try to just ask around, see how people are doing, just to see what's going on, try to get a sense of things. We'll probably publish pictures and just kind of firsthand takes on our social media, maybe a story, if there is a story. And then I'll go up to the panel rooms and I'll be live blogging some of the panels, because not everybody can make it to these conventions. And there's a lot of like interesting news, artwork, commentary, maybe jokes, maybe some fun that I can communicate to the people that can't be there, and really kind of help them have a bit of the comic experience and really learn something from these panels. I'll like for this, I'll be doing a majority of that while fitting in some in-person interviews that'll be filed later. And then at the end of the day, I might go back to the floor and visit with some people. And sometimes there's some after-hours events that I go to try to get some additional stories, or just to network for stories that may not happen for months down the line.
And you're able to do things that the average fan wouldn't be able to do, because you're talking about after-hours stuff. So this could be something where maybe it's a DC cocktail party where they're going to have freelancers who live in the area who are attending the con. Maybe they're going to meet with them, or is that sort of what we're talking about with these after-hours events?
It can be things like that, or it could be just public things where just all the creators happen to be in town. Like sometimes the creators will meet at the bar at the official hotel, and that's open to the public, but you can really mingle with people, make connections. Like you can, I don't know, learn 2 creators that have a friendship that you didn't know about that might turn into a story about how their styles mesh or they don't mesh. But there is some private things that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of. Like I've been doing this since 2003, so I've been able to build some relationships and get some trust with some of the companies that have these closed-door meetings, be it Marvel, DC, Diamond, which is the main distributor for print comics, Comixology, for digital comics, to get inside these kind of maybe smaller groups and kind of get firsthand to understand what's going on and why something's going on, and then figure out a way to communicate that back to our readers in a way that kind of carries that trust that the companies gave us, while at the same time not giving a filtered news story that's biased towards any one company for or against.
So you said the word biased, and this is something when you're talking about panels, I'm assuming that there are panels that you would like to attend. Maybe it's a writer and artist talking about a book that you loved as you were growing up, but maybe it's at a time conflict with a panel that would make a more interesting news story. So do you find yourself in that position where you've got to put that fan voice away and cover the news story, or maybe are you able to say this fan angle is going to be a lot more interesting than something we could cover with a simple press release?
Yeah, that's kind of all goes back to editing. I'm basically doing a form of triage where I'm trying to figure out, with what I can do right now, what would be the best use of my resources. It might be the panel that would get the most interest from people at the time. If we have more than one person, like for example, at San Diego, we'll have a staff of 5 to 6 people all covering panels simultaneously. So we have room to at the same time do the most broadly appealing story at that same time in an hour, while at the same time there may be some indie comic that maybe only 100 people have heard of, but our reporter has a good angle on it or a good understanding on it to maybe translate that and make that more appealing and kind of communicate that fan interest in a professional manner. What I tell my writers is I try to give them stories that they're a fan of, because that like the interest and appreciation will show through, while at the same time having some level of objectivity, so you're not hurting what the readers of our site get from the information. Like everybody has some level of bias towards anything, but it's about understanding that, and in some cases using it. Like I have a bias towards comic books. I'd rather read a comic book than read the newspaper, so I can use that bias in my story. Like I have a bias towards like a superhero title that's not around anymore called Wildcats, and if they relaunch that, I might be the best person to cover that panel, because I would have a lot of knowledge like already baked in that I wouldn't have to go up and research, that I could use to communicate the story as it's happening live to people. Like when we go to panels, like we literally report live. Like say if Jim Lee says so and so is going to be in Wildcats, like everybody who reads our site knows about it within the next 2 minutes. Like even though that happened in one little room that fits 50 people in San Diego, there's people in India reading about it within 3 to 4 minutes with the power of the internet. So like that, to be able to communicate and translate that information to people is something that I appreciate having that, and so I try to communicate that and give context. And do it and provide it for our readers.
Now you mentioned Wildcats, which is one of those great Image series from, gosh, almost 30 years ago. So when we think about the changes that companies like Image brought to the world of comics, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the last 10, 20 years to the way comics are being produced and the way that the audiences are able to get comics?
I'll hit on that last point first. I think just 10 years ago, the primary place to get comics was either in your comic store. They were around in bookstores, and you could get them in your local newspaper maybe. But now digital is a huge part of the industry. Graphic novels have become more prevalent, like they're carried in Walmarts and Targets. There's even DC does exclusive comics for Walmart, and they've done exclusive comics for Target. And it's not just a marketing or a tie-in to some toy, but it's comics as comics. But also like there's comics shared on Facebook that people that don't even read comics or comic books and wouldn't even call themselves comics fans might read things like Sarah's Scribbles or even the old Far Side comic strips. So the people that are reading comics is a lot bigger, and it's a lot more accessible for all kinds of people who maybe don't go to a comic store or don't have a comic book store near them. So it's just become more accessible for everybody.
Thinking of traditional publishers, there are a lot of artists who were working for traditional publishers, but now are publishing on their own through crowdfunding. So I'm wondering, in your work as a journalist, do you cover any of those Kickstarter or Indiegogo campaigns specifically, or maybe as a trend?
We've been covering Kickstarters, like Indiegogo, Patreons, since they started out. We have a good relationship with those companies, and at first, most people covered it as the fact that it was on Kickstarter was the main news item to the story. But I appreciate that that's kind of become a background thing. Like it's not about how you come about; it's about what the comic is. And we'll cover a comic, and basically, if it's on Kickstarter or if it's through Image, isn't the deciding factor in that, but it's part of the story. Like, so if I was to cover, I don't know, a new Jeff Bone graphic novel, I would cover it no matter if it was published by Scholastic or Image or was self-published through Kickstarter. But Kickstarter would be part of the story, but now it's become so accepted that it's not the story.
When it comes to the story, let's say it is about a comic that's coming out. Do you focus on the storyline? Do you focus on the creator? Is there some sort of I guess, tool or device that you use in order to decide which is the more interesting angle? Maybe it's the return of some creator to a character, or maybe it's just the fact that the book is being published at all.
There's no one right answer, and that's what makes the job difficult, but also makes it interesting. Sometimes the story is in the creators involved. Sometimes the story is in just the plot. Sometimes the story, like you said, is about a character returning or a massive change to the status quo for the character. And it's really about being well read enough in comics to understand and kind of see what'll be of interest to people, and then communicating that for our readership. So it's about understanding the comic, but also understanding who's reading Newsarama in this instance, and how to communicate what they would find interesting about it, and get them basically, like, provide them an on-ramp into getting into the story and understanding it. And then when they get to our article, we've built that inroad, we've built that on-ramp, and they can kind of explain the multifaceted part of the comic. So it's about the creators. It's about the story. For some instances, it may be about the printing. Like DC is expanding with, like experimenting with different size comics, different paper stocks, maybe some design elements to kind of really paint a full picture of what this comic book is as an experience.
You started out reading comics. You were a fan of comics, and now you write about comics. I'm assuming you still read comics because that's part of the job. So has that ever been has that moment happened when you're thinking to yourself, man, this has become work? Or is it still, I get to read comics, this is great, and I get to write about comics, which is still great?
I do admit that I read comics differently when I'm reading them for work than when I'm reading them for a fan. Like also, for instance, last year I was a judge for the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards. It's like the Oscars for comics. And I learned a third way of reading for that, where I'm reading to decide its merits critically in terms of artistic and storytelling. So I definitely read in three different ways. And I consciously and subconsciously approach the book differently depending on that. Like, for instance, we're recording here on a Thursday. New comics came out Wednesday. So the comics that I read on Wednesday were primarily for work. So I read them looking for different things than if I was to read them just for pure enjoyment, where I might appreciate different elements and might be able to read it slower. We pride ourselves on reading as much as we can that comes out every week, and then trying to point out, like, what's the best that's come out. Like, it's kind of like seeing like a river flow by, and like, and you can't grab the whole river, but you can see little things that are floating in the river, kind of grab that and kind of understand it. So there's definitely different types of reading that I have to do, and it's part of what's make the job enjoyable. But sometimes there is a grading experience. Well, I'll read a comic, for example, for work and get one opinion on it. But then when I go back and read it for pleasure, I'll get a far different experience that'll make me reconsider why I read it the way I did when I was reading it for work, and vice versa.
It's got to be difficult, because I know for me, if I read a comic the first time, I'll get one blush out of it. And like you just said, you could read it again with a different mindset and get a second feeling for it. But if you're writing about it, that first blush might be all you get to write about. It seems a silly question, but have you written something about a comic and then regretted it? Either you were too harsh or too glowing in praise?
I don't do a lot of reviews anymore. I try to focus on the editorial. But when I was for instance, with the Eisners, some of the work that I was recommending that should be nominated for awards is maybe things that we didn't cover in depth for Newsarama, and I was kind of judging myself on why didn't we give this more coverage? Why didn't we spend more time on it? And they kind of understand it's kind of different masters, and you're serving kind of different things, and there's this whole speed of what's coming, because like, I could focus today on writing a story about a comic that came out last week, but then keep in mind there's about 100 comics coming out next week that need to be written about too. So like I was saying before, it's all a matter of triage, trying to decide what's the best thing to do in this moment. And there's no right way to do it, and there will always be some Monday morning quarterbacking on, I should have done this different, I should have done that different. But then like it's a matter of really looking at it, understanding that, and maybe try to apply some of those things you learned for the next time you're in that situation.
I guess it's sort of that mentality that they talk about baseball relief pitchers have to have. They might give up a home run today, but tomorrow they've got to get in there and get that third out. An odd segue, but from what I understand, looking at your website, you've written some comics as well as written about comics. I was wondering if you could tell us sort of the different mindset that it takes to be a creative writer versus someone who's writing about a creative process.
Before I wrote about comics as a journalist, I created comics in the 90s, and then I focused on being a reporter. And then when I was freelance, I decided to do both for a time. I had some short stories in various Image Comics anthologies. I did a nonfiction comic about Princess Diana, and I did a few like other things that weren't published. I haven't really been working on that anymore. I've been focusing all my attention on writing about comics, but going through that process and understanding how a comic is made, not just writing it, but understanding talking to the artist, talking to the letterer, talking to the publisher, and just seeing how reporters react to it. That has become invaluable for me as an editor and a writer now, to kind of see the other side of it and understand the situation. When I'm talking to other writers, whether it be formal mentoring or just kind of talking shop, I tell them like every reporter or writer about comics, whether it be a commentary writer, a reviewer, should create a comic just to learn what you're basically judging and writing about. Like having that firsthand experience is really helpful in understanding basically what you're judging them on. So you can, I don't know, just have a deeper level of understanding of what it takes to put out a comic book.
And is this something that you would suggest, just to keep that muscle, I guess condition, maybe putting out a comic or thinking about a comic, just to make sure that you're still able to make that connection with the process a little bit stronger?
Yeah, I definitely think so. That's probably something that I should take to heart and do myself. Maybe make another web comic. Maybe I should get you to start creating some comics, and then we can have a follow-up to this conversation and see what you learned.
I would love to do that. That would give me a reason to actually sit down at the drawing board again instead of talk about how I need to sit down at the drawing board. But I see we have about 3 minutes left in our conversation, and I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about the changing landscape of comics. You cover web comics, you cover print comics, you cover, collected editions. So when we start to see this change in marketplace, are we seeing a change in fandom, or are fans just, adapting because there's a new venue for them to get the comics they want to read?
I think the fans were there, but I think now they're more understood and they're more visible. Like fans were reading manga in the 70s and 80s, not as many people, but now they've kind of come into the forefront. People were reading comic books as graphic novels in the 80s and 90s, but now they're in the forefront. And so the fandom has grown, but they're kind of in various pockets. There's not necessarily this big gap between someone who is a comics fan that reads comics all the time and a casual comics reader that might read comics as part of reading other things too. So there might not be self-professed comics fans, just like you may not call yourself a movie fan, but you watch movies, or you're a TV fan, you watch TV. It's just kind of become more accepted and not a niche experience. So the comics fans from the 70s and 80s and even before that are still there, but now there's other groups that are also out there, and then comics are now being more accessible to them, and also there's more diversity in content and in who's creating it, that people can find stories that's more like what they want to see in comics.
Well, Chris, I see we have about 1 minute left. I was wondering if you wanted to tell the folks who are watching how they could find out more about you or Newsarama.
I encourage everybody to go directly to newsarama.com. We post stories there pretty much every day of the week, but strongest on Monday through Friday. We also have a social media presence on Twitter and Facebook if you want to follow us through there. Personally, I'm on Twitter at chrisarrant.com. I believe they'll have it on here on the screen, or you can just Google me. where I talk about comics and kind of show more of the fan side of things, where I might scan a panel from some comic I'm reading, and there might be some jokes and there might be some insider baseball terminology, but I try to like always keep it fun and kind of show like what it's like for someone like me that's kind of working in the industry and kind of talking about comics.
Well, Chris, I'd like to thank you for talking with me today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.